I think the time is a minute past 3 o'clock, and in this time of Teams and Zoom and digital meetings, all the meetings start more or less on time. So I welcome Majbritt Lyck-Bowen and to this session on my 5 best advice as a part of a week of Neighbours. Majbritt, I hand the floor to you.
Thank you so much. First, a quick word about myself. I'm a research fellow at the Winchester Centre for Religion, Reconciliation and Peace in the UK, University of Winchester. And one of the many things I've done over the last couple of years is work on or lead a project on multi-faith approaches to integration. I have also quite recently worked for CAICID, developing some policy briefs for a conference that they held in Lisbon in October last year. We were looking at really trying to map the field of participation, looking at 3 different areas. And more recently, I've also joined the research team for A World of Neighbours. And there I'm working on developing a project on welcoming the stranger, where we're looking into developing multi-faith ethics for migration that will hopefully help in people's practice. So that was just a quick little word about me. I thought we would look at 5 different areas today. So first, a quick word about reflexive practice, then looking at how we can use research to inspire and inform new projects, how we can use research to evaluate integration projects, how we then identify what is relevant literature, and finally also how we definitely need to make sure that we think about how we use the research critically as well, and I'll come back to how we do that. So I'm hoping there's also going to be a bit of time at the end for some questions. Okay, so first, let's look at reflexive practice. So what do we mean by that? What I really mean by that is that it is important with every practice we do, and that it's not just in integration, or it's in peace building and whatever else we do as well, that we really get a good understanding of what it is that we're doing, and that we really reflect on what it is that we're doing. So it is really this idea that we don't just look at a project and think, yeah, that works really well, but we're really trying to understand why it is that it is working well. And this is important, especially if you're trying, if you have a project and it works really well, and you want to set it up in other locations, for example, or with other refugee groups of refugees and migrants, it's really important we have a good understanding of why this project is working well. And it's the same really when we talk about the role of religion in integration. It is easy enough to say that we think religion has a positive role to play in integration, but how actually does that actually pan out? So one way you can use the research to begin to understand these different processes by looking at this particular article, for example, by Laura Sanfrini from a couple of years ago, that really looks at the connections between religion and the integration of migrants. And it has quite a lot of it looks at many different contexts as well. So I'd recommend that one. It's also really important when we talk about reflexive practice that we don't just see migrants and refugees as one big group. We understand that there are many differences within this group. One of the differences is intergenerational. So, for example, it makes a difference whether you are working with youth or whether you're working with slightly older people. Yeah, I will just show that I can actually see that as well. Yeah, and sorry, gotta just make this a bit bigger. Sorry, I just wanted to see the chat box, but that actually makes it quite small. Yeah, and also it's really important, even when we talk about religion, for example, it's really important that we don't see particularly religious groups as, again, one coherent group. We need to understand, in order to understand why a particular project works well or doesn't work very well, we need to understand the differences between groups as well, and within groups as well. So a study here, for example, looks at the difference it makes whether the refugee belong to a minority or majority religious groups in their country of origin, and the differences that makes for their integration. So really, by understanding these little differences, we will understand why certain things are working and other things are not working. So that's where the whole ideas around reflective practice, that we really think quite carefully about that, because that's the only way we can really learn from experiences. And the literature can really help us understand what it is that's going on, and why we see why we see what we see. A second area I really think where literature is really important is it can really help us inspire and inform new projects. So it can help us give inspiration for new ideas, so it can come up with ideas that we hadn't thought about beforehand. And it can also make sure that we make good decisions, so we can make good decisions about new projects based on the experience of many other people that has been studied in the literature. So, for example, if you were thinking about setting up a project that had to do with multi-religious cooperation, so where you would be cooperating with people from a different religion, you could have a look at our project, at one of our articles that really were looking at the advantages of that. Similarly, if you were looking at interreligious dialogue, there are many different articles around that as well. I pinpointed one that had looked at the negative consequences of that, because interreligious dialogue gets a lot of positive praise at the moment, but there are also some negative sides that we need to be aware of, and the literature has identified some of them. There's, for example, an article here from Germany that was basically studying interreligious dialogue in Osnabrück in Germany, and two of the conclusions that they came to was really this that interreligious dialogue, in that particular context at least, actually preserved the status quo power relation. So it preserved rather than challenged the power relation between the minority Muslim population and the majority Christian population. So it didn't do anything to challenge those power relations. The article also argued that the Muslim community was really much seen as the other, and there wasn't really enough recognition of intersectionality. And intersectionality really is this idea that our identity is comprised of many different things. So we don't just define ourselves in terms of our religion. So we define ourselves in terms of our ethnicity, our family, our education, the work we do, etc. And they were basically saying that with interreligious dialogue, it emphasized too much the religious part of people's identity. So something to think about if you were wanting to do interreligious cooperation or dialogue. On a more practical side, you could also, if you were considering setting up a language cafe, you could also look into the literature to see how that can be done successfully. And again, I found two articles focusing on two different aspects. So the first one focuses on making sure that the language cafe doesn't just teach languages, but that it also helps with broader ideas around integration. So the first one here looks at ideas around employment and how we can make sure that refugees and migrants who take part in a language cafe is also getting help with employment. And one of the things this article is arguing that it's important that volunteers and people who work for these projects really share stories of both challenges and success in terms of employment with refugees and migrants that can help migrants feel valuable. So they were basically saying that, if someone was, for example, struggling to find a job as a volunteer or as an employee of that particular project, you could share your own struggles around finding a job, and that would make the refugee and kind of normalize that and make the refugee and migrants feel that it wasn't just them facing that problem. So that was an addition, and you could do if you were opening a language cafe, you could have a think about how you could help with employment as well. The second one looked at political integration, really the same sort of thing, where it was basically saying that if you set up a language cafe and you talk about the political system, the democratic system, you talk about local elections, how local politics work, then you could also, through that, help with political integration. So you could set up a language cafe that doesn't just teach languages, but actually also teaches these other very important things around integration, or help refugees and migrants integrate in many other different ways, again, based on what the experience of other people have been. I also thought we could look at how you can use the literature to help evaluate your project. So again, it's always important that we don't just look at projects and think, yeah, that worked really well. We actually have to have, in most cases, we have to have some data and why it is that we think certain things are working very well. And unfortunately, in terms of integration projects, there was a bit of a lack at times of some really good thorough evaluations. So quite often it doesn't go much further than a quantitative evaluation, such as asking how many people have actually taken part in a project. And just because people take part in a project doesn't mean that they got anything out of it. Just because they show up at a language cafe every week doesn't mean that it's helpful for developing their language skills or those other areas of integration. So So I would definitely argue that it's really important that we include the opinions of refugees and migrants, and there are many different ways we can do that. Again, we can get some inspiration from the literature around that. More generally, there is one study here that, for example, looks at ideas around theory of change. Theory of change is really this idea that we, before we develop a project, we sit down and have a think about what are the kind of changes we want to see, and how are those changes related to each other. So how is one thing going to lead to the next? And part of this is also that we look at some of the key assumptions behind that. So why is it we think that, you know, if we have a project that does A, B, and C, why do we think that the results are then going to be this? So we think quite critically about that. So this article will help us start doing that. And it also includes 4 different approaches to setting up your own evaluation. So again, you can find inspiration from what other people have done around evaluation. There's also another study I mentioned here that looks at, that have used interviews in group interviews with migrants as a way of evaluating the services that they have provided. So again, you could read through this article and find some inspiration as to how that can be done. You can learn the lessons from these researchers who have looked at in these different areas and have used interviews particularly. So again, I would definitely argue that the literature can really help us think about how we can evaluate our integration projects and how to make sure, and even before we set up our project as well, how to make sure that they do become a success. I also then quickly wanted to talk about how we then identify relevant literature. So the easiest way generally is always to just use Google Scholar. So Google Scholar is basically a collection of all academic articles, academic books. It can be a little bit overwhelming, because if you just type in a couple of keywords, it will throw up a crazy amount of different research projects. You know, you will have millions of them. So I've included a guide here that will help you narrow that search down. There are simple things you can do, just even things like on the left side, you can normally decide what year you want. You can specify what year you want the research to be from. And there are different ways that you can use the search function as well to make sure that it uses all the words that you're using as your keywords. I would say one issue that you quite often will face with Google Scholar, unfortunately, is that there is no access to a particular article. This basically happens because academic journals want you to pay for it. So you will find that at times you won't be able to just access it for free. That is changing recently. That has changed. Now it is more and more the author that have to pay for the publication, but beforehand it was very much that you could, as an author, you could publish for free, and then it was the reader that had to pay for it. So it is changing. More and more things are becoming available online and freely accessible. But for the things that aren't, I would say it's always a good idea to contact the author. Easiest way I have found for that is to do it through ResearchGate. ResearchGate is basically it's again a page basically where people publish all their research basically, and it's also, you can find any article, and if you don't have access to that already, you can ask the author directly for access. Another place is LinkedIn, which is also a really good place to find many academics, people from different research centers. Many of them will have a LinkedIn account as well, and you can befriend them through that. And I would say in my experience, most of the time, if you write a really nice email and say, I'm really interested in your research, would you mind sharing it with me? Then most researchers would be very happy to do that, me included. Once you have then found a couple of articles, you can then also use the list and the reference list and the bibliography in that particular article to find more relevant literature. So for example, if there was a particular section that you found really relevant, you can see which other authors have been referenced there, and you can then follow that up through the reference list. You can see where they are. Often actually, if you look it up on the internet, they will have a direct link as well, so that if you click on the reference, it will directly link you to that particular article. So that's really helpful. You can also look at some of the literature that's already available in some of the big research centers. So I've just mentioned a few. There are many others. There's the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace and World Affairs, which is Georgetown University in Washington. They have lots of resources available there. If you're interested in interreligious dialogue, especially, CAICID has quite a lot of publications and resources available. If you are interested more broadly in migration, the OECD has a really good homepage as well, where lots of stuff is available as well. So there are ways you can do that as well. I should say with Google Scholar, you can actually also set up a search, so you will be notified every time an article in a particular area is published. So if there was something you were particularly interested in, you can do that as well, and you will get a notification sent to your email every time somebody publishes in that particular area. So that's really helpful. Another thing that's helpful about Google Scholar is also if you have identified one article and you go and find that article, you will see that quite often on that homepage, you will see that they are automatically adding other articles on the same topic. So if you look on the right, you will see that there's a list of literature that is similar to the one that you're looking at. So that can then take your research a bit further through that as well. Okay. Last but not least, I wanted to just have a quick word about applying critical thinking skills as well. I always think it's really important when we use research that we think quite critically about it as well. And that's both in terms of how we can actually use it and also in terms of the quality of it, really. So focusing perhaps first around what kind of research it is that we should choose. I think one of the things that's really important to be aware of is what kind of case studies that they're using. So, for example, if you are looking at, if you say you are based in Oslo, for example, and you are looking at the article you have found is based on research done in Madrid, Spain. You need to really think quite carefully about the context of that and whether the context in Madrid would be similar to the context in Oslo. So good questions to ask yourself in this regard really is what kind of integration is it that it is focusing on, and is it the same as the one you're focusing on, because you will see that there is variations there. Also really what kind of country region is it that it's focusing on, and is that the same? I think it's especially important to be aware about the differences between whether a country is a transitional one, so are refugees and migrants just passing by that country? Are they arriving at that country and passing by on the road to another country? Because obviously the integration in those countries is going to look quite different from the integration in countries where people are planning to settle full-time or in the long term. Are there also some religious and cultural backgrounds you need to be aware of? Are there again some differences? So, is the project that you're focusing on, if you are trying to set up a project, for example, that mainly focuses on, say, Muslim migrants and refugees, and the study that you're looking at focused on Buddhist refugees, for example, or Hindu refugees, to what you have to then think quite critically about, to what degree can you then use that experience from that to inform your own practice. Same with minority and majority. There's lots of research that focuses on differences between whether you belong to a minority religion or whether you belong to a majority religion. There's also lots of research that shows that the integration works quite differently whether you are settling in an urban area or whether you're settling in a rural area. So that's something to be aware of as well. So again, if you have found a study that focused on an urban area somewhere and you are in a rural area, it doesn't mean that you can't use it. You just need to think more critically about the degree to, whether, how you can use it really. As mentioned earlier already, there's also different generations. So, if you're setting up a program focusing on youth, for example, and you have found some research that didn't necessarily focus on youth, you have to again think quite critically about how you can then use that, because the context is slightly different. One final word about the quality of the research. So generally, I'd say if you find a journal article and it has been peer reviewed basically means that there's a couple of professionals, a couple of specialists, experts in the area that have looked through that article and said, yes, that's good research. Then it can normally be trusted. You need to make sure that you look at reputable research centers and organizations as well. So the organizations I mentioned, for example, and you need to really be aware, because there are because of the internet now, there are lots of different pages. Basically, there's lots of research things being published as research where it actually hasn't had that peer review or where it hasn't gone through any kind of review process. and where there hasn't been that kind of checkup on whether it is good research or not, to the degree to which it is good research. So that's really worth being well aware of when you look for research, to just have a really good think about, to what degree can you actually, what was the quality of the research, and to what degree can you actually apply that in the context that you are working in. Okay, any questions?
Thank you so much for this presentation, really helpful and also thought-provoking. I would encourage the participants to use the chat to send in questions. And meanwhile, maybe I can pose a question to you.
Yeah,
I think many of us are actually always struggling with new applications and ways to find funding. Could you tell us something about thinking around how can we utilize research or findings in research to strengthen also our application for fundings from external donors, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can definitely, in terms of when you're setting up a new project, you can, your project is going to be, your arguments for setting up a particular project is going to be more valid if you can refer to, research that has been done in different contexts where it actually proves that what you're planning to do has worked. So I think that's a really one way you can do it. You can also say, that's what we call informed practice, really. So you are actually making those decisions based on research that has already been done, and you've shown that it had worked in other areas. And that obviously makes it more likely, not to say that there's any guarantees, but it makes it more likely that it will also work in your context. So having thought about that, I think, is really important. I think research can also be used to say that you are going to monitor where you are. So in terms of theory of change, for example, a lot of funding applications will be saying, well, what are the kind of changes you're hoping to see? So you can use some of that literature to develop an idea about what are the kind of steps that you need to take, what are the different phases that you need to go through to get to the aim of the project. And again, you can do that in a research-informed way. So you can say that you have been really thinking about what are the kind of key assumptions that you're basing it on. And you can use, again, the literature to say, I think integration will work because I've read this, I've read all these other articles that said that under these circumstances, other things have worked. If you're, for example, using, if you were interested in issues around religion, for example, there's lots of literature that looks at why religion is working. So you're not just saying I'm setting up a religion, based on religion and because I know that it's going to work, but you can actually say this actually shows that, religion is really helpful for refugees in these different circumstances. This is what we're going to do in our project, and hence, again, you give more validity to your arguments. Really, you make it more valid why you are setting up this particular project, and hence also hopefully making it more likely that you will get the funding.
I can see there are a few questions here in the chat. Yeah, someone asked, could you maybe share some of the links from your presentation, or even the PowerPoint with us afterwards?
I am very happy to share the PowerPoint. You've already got it, so feel free to publish it where we think it's useful, or to send it to the participants. That's absolutely fine. Yeah, definitely.
Thank you. We will put it on the World of Neighbours website together with this film presentation, so you can come back to it. And we have one more question.
Yeah, sorry, just a moment, Sabine. If you, I did put my email here. If you can't access my research, which it should all be freely available. But if you have any issues with it, please just send me an email, and I will happily skip on the articles that we have done so far. More about adults' learning process when designing and changing attitudes, which methods are most effective according to research work. Yeah, I mean, again, it really depends on what kind of context you're working in. But this is definitely an area where you can find research that will help you make these decisions as well. Spreading knowledge, changing attitudes, behaviors. Yeah, there's lots of research that looks at some of that. Actually, maybe you should have, if you haven't already had a look at intercontact theory. Intergroup contact theory will be helpful with this. that is basically a theory that, in a nutshell, argues that when you bring people together, especially around a common aim, then these people start developing relationships, and that can also help change their attitudes towards each other and change the behaviors of people. So if you look up intergroup contact theory, then that will help you with this. Again, there's lots of research done on that.
I would like to ask maybe a question. Please feel free to write more in the chat, but also because we feel this sort of conversation between academia and practitioners are so helpful. Do you have any examples of how academia and the civil society or faith-based organizations collaborate on a very local level to kind of inform each other, and how is that done? How can we reach out to academia from faith-based organizations or society?
I mean, I have just joined this project, actually working for a World of Neighbours, where I think that the original idea did come from some of the practitioners in our World of Neighbours network. They wanted to develop a multi-faith approach, really, or multi-faith ethics to guide their practices. And we are a group of researchers now that will be developing that project with the practitioners. So that's definitely, if you have any context to a World of Neighbours, is definitely a good idea. I would say beforehand, we have also had, at the center I'm working for, we have also often had organizations or even just individuals contacting us to say, this is something we'd be interested for you to look into. Is that something you can do? And yeah, we've taken on, I mean, the project on multi-faith approaches started by just an organization that contacted us and said, we'd wish there was some research on this particular area. Is that something you can do for us? So I would say most practitioners, most academics are quite happy to get inspired by that. And I mean, at the moment, there's very much a push, at least within British universities, to focus more on knowledge exchange. So this is really this idea that academics should focus a lot more on collaborating with civil society, with local actors. There should be, we should be developing much more for the kind of common good. So I think most academics will be very happy to listen to ideas and to develop something together. And there's definitely also a push at the moment to do more participatory research, which is just really this idea that we develop things together. So we're not just wanting to do a project for you, we want to do a project with you, really. So we want to encourage you to take part in the whole research project from the moment we start developing the project to not, so we don't just want you to answer some questions in an interview or in a survey. We want you to really be part of the whole process, really. So yeah, let me just see, was there another? Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Majbritt, for this very rich presentation, and thank you, participants, for sharing your questions as well. It's 1 minute to 3:30, so we're really in the time limits. Thank you so much. This has been a part of a week of Neighbours, and I encourage all participants to join also other seminars that are now online. And I hope to see you all on Thursday at 3:30 when we do a week of Neighbours live. So please join us then. And again, thank you so much, Majbritt, and be prepared for contacts from the practitioners.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And please do contact me either through my email or on LinkedIn.